Because I have a warrant for your arrest for impersonating a police officer.
Came to talk about that ticket, he said, then added, I've got a warrant for your arrest for impersonating a police officer.
When did I say that, sir?
Sir, just step away and place your hands on the car.
I'm post certified. I got my credentials in the car.
Place your hands on the hood, please, sir. Turn around.
The scene opens on a quiet Georgia street, deceptively calm, as two men converge under the shadow of the same symbol, the badge. From the outset, the tension is palpable. One man is unquestionably an officer, armed with the law and the authority it confers. The other claims a similar mantle, but the legitimacy of his claim is immediately in question. This convergence is not merely a meeting. It is a collision of identities, a test of perception, and a crucible in which authority itself is scrutinized. In the stillness of the driveway, the ordinary visual cues of neighborhood life are overlaid by extraordinary psychological and legal stakes. Each movement, glance, and inflection carries amplified significance. The observer is made aware from the very first frame that the ordinary rules of social interaction are suspended by the weight of institutional power. When the officer steps into view, his posture is measured, his movements deliberate. He carries with him decades of procedural training, a confidence refined through years of routine enforcement and repeated deference. Every step is a demonstration of learned authority, the kind that is rarely questioned in everyday policing. Yet the scene, complicated by the presence of Schultz, who asserts his own law enforcement identity, highlights a tension rarely visible in standard procedural encounters. Schultz invokes post-certification credentials, recounts experiences of saving lives, and leverages the language of law enforcement to validate his identity. Yet his inability or refusal to provide a departmental affiliation immediately introduces ambiguity. This is the tension. The viewer is made aware that credentials alone, detached from the recognizable structures of institutional authority, are insufficient to command compliance. The legal and psychological dimensions of authority are distinct yet inseparable here, and the footage captures that intersection in vivid detail. From the very first moments, the dialogue, though not reproduced verbatim, reveals the subtle psychological strategies at play. The officer uses operational safety as a justification for controlling the physical space. This phrase, simple yet legally and psychologically potent, becomes a lever for dominance. It allows the officer to enforce compliance without escalation, but it also masks a deeper implicit question. Who ultimately controls the narrative of authority? In this early interaction, Schultz attempts to assert parity through recitation of his qualifications. Yet the law does not bend to assertion, it bends to verification. This distinction, though technical, is central. The audience can perceive it even before the warrant is formally revealed. Here, documentary analysis highlights how perceived legitimacy and documented authority diverge, and how that divergence drives human behavior under stress. The interplay of pride, expectation, and procedure shapes the emotional landscape, and creating a tension that is both immediate and sustained. The officer's voice, steady and controlled, serves as a tool of psychological modulation. It cuts through the protestations, the appeals to past service, and the insistence on courtesy. There is an intentionality here. Each statement is designed to assert the officer's supremacy in the immediate environment while minimizing the risk of physical escalation. The calm authority masks the complexity of judgment calls. There is a distinction between following procedure mechanically and exercising judgment. In this case, the officer relies on both: procedure to justify actions, judgment to manage the interaction. It is a delicate balance. The moment that unfolds is less about words than about spatial and temporal control, about the orchestration of body language, voice cadence, and legal positioning to establish dominance. The viewer is made to witness not just the enforcement of law, but the performance of authority as a controlled, deliberate act. As Schultz persists in his insistence on post-certification, the tension escalates. His words, infused with pride and a sense of professional accomplishment, become a lens through which the audience witnesses the psychology of perceived authority. The distinction between having a credential and embodying a role becomes a focal point. Schultz's repeated declarations are a bid for recognition, a psychological appeal to shared professional norms. In essence, he is testing the boundaries of institutional acknowledgement. The officer, conversely, responds not with debate, but with action. The physicality of the interaction, the demand to step aside, the instruction to place hands on the vehicle, the securing of handcuffs, crystallizes the theoretical discussion into tangible consequences. Authority is not abstract here. It is applied in real time, and the audience is made acutely aware of how swiftly legitimacy can be challenged and enforced simultaneously. This first act of physical control, though procedural, carries symbolic weight. The handcuffing of Schultz, executed with clinical precision, marks the point at which theory meets enforcement. The action is silent yet deafening in its implication. Authority cannot be claimed through assertion alone. Documentation, verification, and adherence to procedural standards are non-negotiable. The small sound of the cuffs clicking closed is amplified not just by the recording, but by the narrative lens through which the audience views it. Every subtle noise, every pause becomes a narrative device, emphasizing the shift in power dynamics and the fragility of assumed authority. For the trained observer, it is evident that each procedural step is also a psychological maneuver, designed to communicate dominance while minimizing the immediate potential for conflict. The dialogue reveals additional layers of institutional critique. The officer, despite the procedural clarity of the warrant, exhibits a moment of personal judgment. A line delivered that originates from instinct rather than code. This brief intrusion of individual discretion into the formal structure of law enforcement demonstrates a fundamental truth about human behavior in positions of power. Even within tightly codified systems, personal biases, cultural norms, and experiential memory influence decision-making. In this case, the line is not punitive in itself, but it signifies a judgment on Schultz's behavior, an acknowledgement that the perceived breach of professionalism, the misrepresentation of authority, is as significant to the officer as the legal violation itself. The audience is offered a rare glimpse into the personal dimension of policing, where the abstract authority of law intersects with subjective evaluation. The interplay between pride, professional identity, and legal compliance dominates this initial segment. Schultz's repeated insistence on his qualifications, juxtaposed against his inability to name a department, exposes a gap between perceived authority and actual authority. The officer, aware of this gap, navigates the tension with deliberate control. He does not escalate verbally, does not raise his voice, but relies on procedural tools to manage the interaction. This measured response is instructive for the viewer, particularly in understanding how law enforcement personnel balance enforcement with risk mitigation, and how deviations from assumed authority can trigger immediate, tangible consequences. Here, the footage becomes a case study in real-time negotiation of legitimacy, where every word, gesture, and movement contributes to the outcome. The tension is heightened further by Schultz's attempts to negotiate operational courtesies, requests to communicate with his fiancée, to adjust handcuffs, to reconcile pride with compliance, are systematically denied or redirected. Each denial, framed under the guise of safety and protocol, reinforces the primacy of the officer's legal authority while simultaneously illustrating the psychological impact of constrained agency on the subject. This is a critical moment for understanding escalation dynamics. Compliance is not merely enforced through force, but through controlled restriction of choice. The subject's emotional responses, including confusion, disbelief, and waning protest, are as much a part of the interaction as the legal instruments being applied. The footage highlights how even procedural adherence can create profound psychological stress, particularly when personal identity and professional pride are implicated. The broader implications of this encounter are embedded in subtle behavioral cues. Schultz's voice shifts between defense and incredulity. His posture and gestures convey both deference and challenge. The officer's measured calm contrasts sharply, establishing a dynamic of authority and subordination that extends beyond the immediate legal context. Here, documentary analysis captures a critical insight. into law enforcement culture. The performance of authority is simultaneously a social, psychological, and legal act. It requires a nuanced understanding of human behaviour, procedural mastery, and situational awareness. The audience gains an implicit understanding that each word, pause, and movement contributes to the construction of power, legitimacy, and compliance. The interaction demonstrates that authority is not a fixed property, but a fluid state negotiated moment by moment. Institutional accountability is also foregrounded. The warrant, though legally sufficient, represents a broader system of verification, reporting, and oversight. Its presentation underscores the mechanisms that support lawful authority while also highlighting potential gaps. Schultz's claims, juxtaposed with documented verification, illustrate the fragile interface between individual assertion and institutional sanction. For the viewer, this duality is central. Legitimacy is validated not by self-proclamation, but by procedural endorsement. The unfolding interaction becomes a microcosm of law enforcement's broader systemic challenges, ensuring compliance with law while managing individual identity, perception, and procedural rigour. This moment sets the tone for examining the intersection of personal credibility and systemic authority. As the initial engagement concludes, the narrative foreshadows deeper complexities. Schultz's insistence on his certification, the officer's steadfast enforcement, and the refusal to accommodate personal requests collectively reveal the mechanics of power and trust. The tension between assumed identity and legally sanctioned authority drives every interaction. For the viewer, the stakes are clear. This is not merely a procedural arrest. It is a confrontation between perception and verification, between pride and compliance, between human judgment and institutional codification. Every procedural step, every verbal exchange, and every subtle movement becomes a lens through which the audience interrogates the nature of authority itself. Finally, the initial encounter foregrounds the question of identity and legitimacy. Schultz's insistence on his role as a certified peace officer contrasts with the officer's verification of institutional authority. This dissonance is not resolved through argument, but through procedural action. The physical act of securing Schultz, the verbal assertion of operational safety, and the structured denial of personal courtesies collectively enforce a hierarchy of legitimacy. It is a reminder that authority in practice is contingent not on assertion, but on documentation, verification, and control of the immediate environment. The opening minutes of this footage establish a nuanced, multifaceted exploration of power, authority, and human behaviour. In conclusion, the opening minutes of this bodycam footage establish a rich tapestry of psychological tension, procedural authority, and human behaviour. Chidney. Careful orchestration of dialogue, movement, and institutional mechanisms reveals the subtle interplay between claimed authority and verified power. Schultz's repeated appeals, the officer's measured enforcement, and the audience's emergent understanding of escalation dynamics converge to form a compelling study in law enforcement, identity, and legitimacy. This is not merely a procedural arrest. It is an examination of how authority is constructed, challenged, and ultimately reinforced in real time. The narrative momentum, once established, primes the viewer for the deeper exploration of power, compliance, and the consequences of misrepresentation that will unfold in the subsequent segments. As the interaction progresses, the tension that began in the driveway intensifies with each subsequent exchange. What initially appeared to be a simple question of legal authority transforms into a more profound study of perception, identity, and the subtle mechanisms of power in policing. Schultz's insistence on his post-certification credentials becomes increasingly urgent, his appeals to prior service and experience growing more insistent. Each assertion is a psychological maneuver. He seeks to anchor his authority in the shared culture of law enforcement, hoping that recognition of his achievements might temper the officer's insistence on procedural compliance. Yet the officer, methodical and unflinching, relies not on debate or persuasion, but on verification and legal instruments, signalling that identity alone cannot override procedural legitimacy. This creates a dynamic tension, a collision of self-perception against documented authority, which reverberates through every gesture, every glance, and every carefully measured word. From a behavioural perspective, Schultz's repetition of post-certification and professional accomplishment reveals an inherent reliance on cultural authority within policing. He attempts to leverage the symbolic weight of credentials to establish parity with a fully verified officer. The psychological subtext is clear. For many law enforcement professionals, the badge is both a symbol and a lived identity. When that identity is called into question, the immediate human response is often to assert experience and accomplishment as proof of legitimacy. Schultz's repeated references to having saved lives and his insistence on recognition reveal the internal conflict of a person whose social identity is being challenged in real time. The audience is drawn into the dual reality of law enforcement. Authority is both a procedural status and a deeply personal, socially mediated construct, and the tension emerges precisely when these two aspects collide. Meanwhile, the officer's controlled responses underscore the procedural foundation of legitimacy. The refusal to grant Schultz the courtesy of communicating with his fiancée, framed under operational safety, highlights how policy and law intersect with human psychology. Operational safety is a legally valid justification, but it also functions as a psychological tool to assert dominance and maintain control over the scene. The audience observes, without explicit narration, the subtle orchestration of power. Authority is reinforced not merely through legal documentation, but through control of space, limitation of choice, and the strategic management of emotional appeals. Each denial of a request, each calm redirection, builds a cumulative impression of institutional authority that contrasts sharply with Schultz's personal appeals, reinforcing the structural primacy of verified power over assumed power. The act of placing Schultz in handcuffs and instructing him to sit in the vehicle is emblematic of this tension between personal assertion and institutional verification. While the physical action is straightforward and procedural, the narrative weight is immense. Every click of the restraints, every step toward the patrol vehicle, becomes a symbolic assertion of validated authority. The handcuffs themselves are not merely tools of restraint, they are instruments of enforced hierarchy. Through them, the procedural authority of the state manifests physically, and the viewer witnesses firsthand the moment when perceived parity is irrevocably disrupted. Schultz's protests, increasingly subdued, reveal the psychological impact of controlled compliance. His identity as a law enforcement professional is undermined by the unambiguous application of verified authority, creating a dissonance that informs the subsequent behaviour and interactions captured on camera. Simultaneously, the interaction reveals the nuanced dynamics of bias and personal judgment within policing. The officer, despite the clear legal authority of the warrant, injects occasional moments of personal commentary, a line here, a judgment there, that reflect experiential biases accumulated over decades of service. These intrusions are brief but significant, highlighting the duality of law enforcement. Authority is grounded in law, yet human judgment inevitably shapes its exercise. The subtle distinction between procedural enforcement and personal evaluation provides the audience with insight into the mechanisms by which discretionary power operates within structured systems. It is here that the narrative transcends the immediate interaction and becomes a lens for understanding broader patterns of behaviour in policing, demonstrating how personal experience, cultural expectations, and institutional norms intersect to shape outcomes in real-world encounters. Schultz's persistent appeals to post-certification, coupled with his refusal to identify a department, underscore the psychological and procedural complexities of identity verification. The officer confronted with ambiguous claims must navigate a delicate balance. He cannot simply accept verbal assertions, yet he must apply enforcement with minimal escalation. This tension illustrates the core challenge in policing encounters involving disputed authority. Verification is non-negotiable, yet the human dimension, pride, fear, confusion, must be managed in real time. The audience observes the procedural safeguards and structured responses that maintain legal legitimacy, while simultaneously witnessing the human drama of identity under siege. Each moment of hesitation, each request denied, Each redirection becomes part of a larger narrative, demonstrating how law, psychology, and institutional authority coalesce. Throughout this segment, the footage also exposes systemic insights. The warrant itself, formally authorized by judicial oversight, represents not just a tool of immediate enforcement, but a reflection of institutional procedures designed to ensure accountability and legitimacy. Yet the interaction demonstrates that systemic processes alone cannot fully address the ambiguity inherent in personal claims of authority. Schultz's insistence on post-certification, even in the absence of departmental verification, presents a challenge that underscores the limits of procedural systems when confronted with nuanced claims of identity. The audience is made aware that legal authority exists within a larger ecosystem of verification, trust, and human interpretation, where procedural legitimacy intersects with social perception and psychological negotiation. Cinematic and auditory elements captured in the bodycam footage amplify these dynamics. The click of handcuffs, the measured cadence of speech, and the framing of each visual cue convey more than mere procedural detail. They immerse the audience in the unfolding psychological tension. Subtle cues such as the spatial arrangement between officer and subject, the angles of approach, and the visual focus on restrained movements heighten the perception of authority and control. In combination with the dialogue and procedural actions, these elements transform a routine law enforcement encounter into a layered study of human behavior, legal boundaries, and power dynamics. The audience is drawn into an almost participatory experience, able to pass the nuanced interplay between assertion, compliance, and institutional enforcement. Moreover, the encounter highlights the cumulative impact of repeated appeals and denials on the subject's psychology. Schultz oscillates between insistence, disbelief, and eventual acquiescence. Each denied request reinforces the structural hierarchy and the procedural supremacy of the officer, while simultaneously eroding Schultz's self-perceived authority. The interaction provides a tangible demonstration of how procedural enforcement, when paired with deliberate psychological management, shapes behavior and perception. It is not the mere existence of the warrant that enforces compliance. It is the combination of verified authority, controlled space, and systematic response to appeals that produces a definitive outcome. The audience witnesses authority exercised with precision, both legal and psychological, and the profound effects of that execution on the individual subjected to it. The segment also underscores broader cultural dimensions within policing. Schultz's appeals to post-certification, the invocation of life-saving experience, and the insistence on recognition reflect a deeply ingrained professional culture. Law enforcement identity is not only procedural, but symbolic, constructed through shared norms, accomplishments, and peer validation. When that identity is questioned or undermined, the emotional and behavioral responses are immediate and intense. Conversely, the officer's calm, procedural response reflects both adherence to institutional norms and the internalization of a broader organizational culture that prioritizes verification over assertion. The juxtaposition of these cultural frameworks offers the audience a rare window into the internal and external dimensions of authority, revealing the interplay of pride, legitimacy, and institutional validation. Finally, the interaction demonstrates the limits of self-assertion in the face of verified authority. Schultz's repeated references to certification, previous service, and professional accomplishment ultimately fail to shift the procedural reality established by the warrant. Authority, as manifested through legal instruments, spatial control, and procedural compliance, prevails over personal claims. The audience gains an understanding of how the law operationalizes authority in ways that transcend individual identity, while simultaneously appreciating the human cost of constrained autonomy and challenged professional identity. The scene encapsulates a fundamental tension within law enforcement encounters: the collision of personal legitimacy with institutional verification, and the psychological and procedural mechanisms by which one ultimately asserts dominance over the other. In conclusion, this portion of the footage reveals a multi-layered examination of authority in action. Schultz's insistence, the officer's measured responses, and the procedural enforcement mechanisms collectively illustrate how legitimacy is both constructed and contested. The audience witnesses a dynamic interplay of law, psychology, and human behavior, where authority is continually negotiated through verification, control, and perception. This segment deepens the viewer's understanding of escalation, identity, and procedural legitimacy, setting the stage for subsequent developments in the encounter. It is a study of how power is exercised, challenged, and ultimately reinforced in real time, providing a rich foundation for analysing the consequences of misrepresented authority within the broader framework of law enforcement. As the encounter progresses into its final stages, the psychological and procedural stakes reach a peak, crystallising the consequences of misrepresented authority and the rigour of institutional enforcement. The previous moments of tension, the assertion of post-certification, the repeated denials, and the carefully orchestrated procedural compliance now converge to reveal a more profound dynamic: the intersection of personal identity, law, and systemic accountability. Schultz, who has relied upon the symbolic power of his claimed credentials, experiences the weight of institutional legitimacy firsthand. Every word, gesture, and procedural action underscores the inescapable truth. Authority in practice is verified, not declared. One of the most striking aspects of this segment is Schultz's shifting emotional state. Initially, his insistence on post-certification and prior service reflects a defensive posture grounded in professional pride. He attempts to reconcile the cognitive dissonance between his self-perceived authority and the procedural reality he faces. As the encounter continues, however, the intensity of institutional enforcement begins to dominate, gradually eroding Schultz's confidence in his own claims. This shift highlights a critical insight into escalation psychology. When personal identity is challenged by verified authority, the ensuing tension is both psychological and procedural. The audience observes a real-time collapse of self-assuredness as external validation, or the lack thereof, dictates the trajectory of the interaction. The officer's measured conduct continues to serve as the backbone of procedural legitimacy. By maintaining composure and adhering to standardized enforcement protocols, he models the exercise of authority that is both effective and restrained. The refusal to grant Schultz access to his fiancée under the pretext of operational safety exemplifies how discretion and policy intersect. While this decision may appear rigid, it demonstrates the balancing act inherent in law enforcement. Compliance must be enforced while minimizing risk to all parties. The audience gains insight into how seemingly small procedural decisions can carry disproportionate weight in shaping outcomes, influencing behavior, and communicating power. Each denial, redirection, and instruction reinforces the hierarchy of verified authority over asserted or symbolic claims. A pivotal dimension of this segment is the examination of Schultz's insistence on post-certification. Certification, while a significant marker within law enforcement culture, is ultimately insufficient when detached from departmental affiliation and verified credentials. Schultz's repeated references to certification highlight the tension between symbolic authority and formal legitimacy. He invokes professional norms and shared cultural expectations as a psychological strategy, attempting to elicit recognition and, by extension, leniency. Yet the officer's response, calm, procedural, and unyielding, underscores a fundamental principle of law enforcement. Legitimacy is procedural, not performative. This tension exemplifies how authority operates simultaneously as a psychological construct and a codified system of power, offering the audience an intricate study of identity negotiation under stress. Throughout this segment, spatial and behavioral cues continue to underscore the dynamics of power. Schultz's positioning, gestures, and tone reflect both deference and residual assertion. Each appeal, whether for recognition, communication, or procedural courtesy, is counterbalanced by the officer's spatial control, verbal precision, and methodical enforcement. The audience is made aware of the choreography implicit in high-stakes law enforcement encounters. Authority is communicated, as much through physical presence and spatial management as through procedural instruments. By analysing these subtle interactions, viewers gain insight into the mechanics of control and the ways in which law enforcement personnel employ both psychological and physical strategies to maintain dominance without resorting to overt aggression. The procedural rigour of the officer is mirrored by the structural and legal underpinnings of the warrant itself. Signed by a judge and grounded in statutory authority, the warrant represents both institutional verification and a system of accountability. Yet the interaction reveals that procedural tools alone are insufficient when confronted with ambiguous or contested claims of authority. Schultz's insistence on his post-certification, combined with his reluctance to name a department, creates a grey zone in which human judgment must complement institutional mechanisms. The officer's measured approach demonstrates how law enforcement relies on a combination of codified rules and situational discretion, ensuring that compliance is achieved while maintaining procedural integrity. This dynamic provides a critical lens for viewers to understand both the strengths and limitations of institutional authority. Psychologically, the encounter illustrates the erosion of perceived legitimacy when unverified claims collide with institutional verification. Schultz, who initially relied upon cultural and symbolic markers of authority, is confronted with the incontrovertible reality of procedural enforcement. His repeated appeals, initially assertive and confident, gradually become subdued, reflecting a shift in both emotion and strategy. The audience witnesses a tangible manifestation of the psychological cost of contested authority. Pride and identity are challenged, and the individual must navigate the tension between self-perception and externally validated power. This observation provides insight into broader patterns of escalation and compliance, highlighting how authority, once verified and enacted, reshapes interpersonal dynamics and individual behaviour. Cinematic and auditory cues captured in the footage amplify these dynamics. The measured cadence of dialogue, the subtle click of restraints, and the framing of spatial relationships reinforce the psychological weight of authority. The camera, while not intrusive, provides a continuous and objective lens, allowing the audience to observe the nuanced interplay between procedural enforcement and human behaviour. Visual focus on hand positioning, vehicle proximity, and physical orientation creates a sense of immediacy and immersion. These cues complement the narrative of procedural legitimacy, enabling the audience to analyse power dynamics with precision and to appreciate the subtleties of compliance, control, and identity negotiation. As the encounter nears its conclusion, the broader implications of misrepresented authority become increasingly apparent. Schultz's inability to substantiate his claimed affiliation renders his post-certification largely symbolic. The officer's procedural enforcement, however, is both real and immediate, creating a stark contrast between claimed authority and institutional legitimacy. This contrast underscores a key lesson in law enforcement and civic accountability. The law is enforced not based on assertion or cultural markers, but through verified and codified mechanisms. The audience is reminded that legitimacy is contingent, procedural, and rigorously tested, and that personal pride or symbolic markers cannot substitute for verification. The segment also explores the consequences of institutional failure and systemic gaps. Schultz's claims, while contested, highlight potential vulnerabilities within law enforcement verification processes. The scenario prompts reflection on how departments vet credentials, track certification, and verify identity before enforcement actions are taken. This insight is crucial. The encounter serves as a case study in both procedural rigour and institutional accountability, illustrating how minor lapses in verification or reliance on assumption can escalate into high-stakes confrontations. By situating the encounter within this broader systemic context, the audience gains an understanding of how individual actions are nested within organisational frameworks, and how those frameworks both constrain and empower law enforcement personnel. The psychological interplay of pride, compliance, and legitimacy reaches its apex in this segment. Schultz, faced with undeniable procedural enforcement, begins to reconcile his personal identity with the reality of the situation. The gradual softening of his tone, the diminution of protest, and the increasing acceptance of procedural authority reveal how institutional power is internalized and recognized, even when it conflicts with personal perception. This internalization is a critical observation for understanding compliance dynamics. Authority is not only enforced externally, but also absorbed cognitively, shaping behavior and perception in ways that extend beyond the immediate encounter. The audience is positioned to witness the subtle, yet profound transformation that occurs when symbolic power is subordinated to verified authority. Throughout the footage, the encounter maintains an unbroken tension between human psychology and institutional enforcement. Schultz's repeated appeals to recognition, the officer's unwavering adherence to procedural norms, and the subtle orchestration of space and control demonstrate the multifaceted nature of authority. The narrative emphasizes that law enforcement is not simply a series of actions or commands. It is a complex negotiation of identity, legitimacy, and compliance. Every gesture, instruction, and procedural decision serves as both an operational and psychological tool, illustrating the depth and complexity inherent in seemingly routine enforcement actions. Ultimately, this segment underscores a profound truth. Authority, once verified and enforced, exerts a tangible influence over perception, behavior, and identity. Schultz's initial claims, grounded in personal experience and symbolic legitimacy, are rendered secondary to procedural verification and institutional authority. The officer's measured enforcement, grounded in legal and procedural foundations, asserts dominance without excess, providing a model of how law enforcement balances the competing imperatives of compliance, discretion, and safety. The audience gains an understanding of how legitimacy is constructed, challenged, and ultimately reinforced in real-time encounters, and how individual identity interacts with institutional verification to shape outcomes. In conclusion, the final stages of this encounter provide a comprehensive examination of authority in action. Schultz's assertions, the officer's procedural enforcement, and the interplay of psychological, spatial, and institutional factors converge to reveal the multifaceted dynamics of legitimacy, compliance, and identity negotiation. The segment illuminates how law, procedure, and human judgment interact to enforce authority while managing risk, how symbolic and verified authority diverge and collide, and how the consequences of misrepresentation are realized in real time. The audience is left with a detailed understanding of how power is exercised, contested, and reinforced, providing a lens through which to analyze both individual behavior and systemic processes in law enforcement contexts. This encounter serves not only as a documentation of a single arrest, but as a case study in the mechanics of authority. Every procedural choice, every denial, every measured response illustrates the balance between law, discretion, and human psychology. Schultz's journey from confident assertion to procedural acquiescence highlights the limits of symbolic authority when confronted with verified legal power. For viewers, the encounter offers insight into the subtle mechanisms by which legitimacy is enacted, how human behavior adapts under pressure, and how institutional authority shapes outcomes in ways that are both immediate and enduring. By the conclusion, the audience understands that legitimacy is not simply claimed. It is verified, demonstrated, and reinforced through structured action. Schultz's experience underscores the personal consequences of misrepresented authority, while the officer's methodical enforcement exemplifies the disciplined exercise of institutional power. The encounter, captured in real time, provides a rich narrative that intertwines law, psychology, and human behavior, offering a profound lesson in the dynamics of authority, compliance, and identity within the context of law enforcement.